Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. We're continuing to look at Daniel chapter 9, the latter part of the chapter that deals with Daniel's third vision, the vision of the 70 sevens. Now, yesterday we saw that the last of those sevens, the last week of years, is set apart. And we also saw that during that last week will arise the Antichrist, which we've seen identified before as the little horn. Let's read the last verse of chapter 9 again. He, this is the little horn, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. That is the last seven, that last week of years. In the middle of the seven, in the middle of that week of years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now we know the end that is decreed that will be poured out on him is the final judgment. We saw this in chapter 7 when he was first mentioned, as he oppresses the people of God, and then the court of God's holy ones is called. The Ancient of Days is on the throne, and the Son of Man comes to inherit the kingdom. And the little horn, the Antichrist, is swept away and destroyed in the judgment. But before that judgment is poured out, there will be this abomination that causes desolation. Now, this is mentioned 4 times in the book of Daniel. It was first mentioned in chapter 8 when it says that the little horn, and chapter 8, that was the Antichrist of the Old Testament, Antiochus Epiphanes. It is said concerning the daily sacrifice, he will abolish it, and he will cause a rebellion that causes desolation. And then in chapter 9, when it's talking about the Antichrist at the end of time, it says he will bring an end to sacrifice, and he will set up the abomination that causes desolation. In chapter 11, he will be mentioned again as the one who will abolish the sacrifice and will cause up to be set up the abomination that causes desolation. And then in chapter 12, it says he will attempt to abolish the sacrifice again, and again it references to the abomination that causes desolation. So part of this Antichrist attack upon the people of God is the attempt to do away with sacrifice, that is, to do away with the worship of God. And 4 times is mentioned this abomination that causes desolation. Now, Jesus also references this in Matthew chapter 24, when the disciples have asked him, what will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? He gives a long discussion about persecution against the people of God. And then in chapter 24 of Matthew, verse 15, he says, so, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and etc. as he continues. But Jesus references the abomination that causes desolation from Daniel the prophet, which, as we've said, is in chapter 9 and is actually mentioned 4 times throughout the book of Daniel. And so Jesus sees that prophecy as being fulfilled at the end of time before the second coming. So he sees a time of the rise of Antichrist to oppress the people of God, this abomination that causes desolation, and then, of course, the final judgment will follow. Now we're asking, what is the abomination that causes desolation? Now, I've already seen of the 4 references to it in the book of Daniel. Chapter 8 refers to the Old Testament Antichrist, Antiochus Epiphanes, in 167 BC. And then the other 3 references in chapters 9, 11, and 12 refer to a future manifestation of the Antichrist that will come toward the end of time. So we get some understanding of what the abomination of desolation will be in the future by what it was in the past. We look at what Antiochus Epiphanes did in 167 BC. That's referenced in chapter 8 of Daniel, and that gives us an idea of what the final Antichrist will do. That's referenced in chapters 9, 11, and 12 of Daniel, as well as Matthew chapter 24. So what was it Antiochus did that was called the abomination that causes desolation? Antiochus went into the temple in Jerusalem and desecrated it by offering a sacrifice on the altar that was dedicated for the sacrifices to God. Antiochus on that altar offered a sacrifice to Zeus, the head of the Greek mythological pantheon. Zeus in Greek mythology was the king of the gods. And so Antiochus desecrated the temple by offering sacrifice to Zeus instead of to the true God, the true Lord. And the sacrifice he offered on the altar was a pig. He offered a pig in sacrifice to Zeus. Now you can see how that completely desecrated the temple. It would be 3 years after Antiochus did this, about 3.5 years actually, before the temple was recaptured by Jewish forces and reconsecrated for the worship of God. But it had been desolated. It had been made contemptible by what Antiochus did, that worship to Zeus and the sacrifice of a pig. So Antiochus's abomination that causes desolation was worshiping a false god in a way that made contemptible the things of God. So the other prophecies of Daniel foresee a day when an Antichrist will arise who will try to pull people away from the worship of the true God and cause them to worship that which is false. This is the abomination of desolation. To call people away and try to force them no longer to worship Christ and the living God, but instead to worship false gods. In the case of the Antichrist, when he arises at the end of time, he will cause people to try and worship himself. He will set himself up as God. So you see, this has happened before, and it will happen again at the end when there's that temptation by the Antichrist to cause people to quit worshiping the true God and to worship the false God. That is the abomination that causes desolation. Jesus says, when you see that happening, you know the end is near. We'll talk a little bit about this more tomorrow, so I hope you'll join us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel.